So it's a misconception that the American Revolutionary Movement grew up organically across the colonies with no single leader. Dickinson was the leader. All the leaders of the colonies were local. Dickinson was the only one who was colony-wide. And so they were all looking to him and following his guidance. So then, in advance of the first Congress, Dickinson, with help of allies like Charles Thompson, really sort of wrangled these hostile factions, factions who had been at each other's throats for decades. Dickinson managed to get them all more or less on the same page and working together because all of them trusted him. He also did something really remarkable, which I argue is the most revolutionary moment of the revolution, and that is that he wrote gender-inclusive language to protect women's religious liberty, but also their freedom of public speech, because Quaker women preached, and he wrote in there that all persons should be able to practice his or her religion. So, and practice religion was public speaking for women, for Quaker women.
Welcome to Too Complicated for History. My name is Isaac S. Loftus, and as always, I am joined by my co-host, Dr. Lynn Price Robbins.
Hey, everyone.
We come to you twice a month to bring you the history that has fallen through the cracks of your curriculum. And today, we're talking about the American founding era. And it's interesting to think about America's founding because it worked. From our current perspective, it seems like that was inevitable. But today, we're talking about someone who didn't sign the Declaration of Independence, but at the same time signed up for a militia. He believed in what he was doing, but wasn't part of that really famous document. Lynn, could you care to introduce our topic and who we're speaking to today?
Yes, absolutely. So really excited to have Dr. Jane E. Calvert with us today. She is the founding director and chief editor of the John Dickinson Writings Project, and also author of the book Penman of the Founding, a biography of John Dickinson. Thanks so much for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
So I'm excited. I know you from the John Dickinson Writing Project days, and I've always kind of wondered why John? Why is he somebody that you kind of you became the expert of? I mean, he's pretty much been your entire career. Is that true? Focusing more or less on him. So how did that happen?
Yeah, so studying the founding was not my intent when I went to graduate school, let alone a founding, quote unquote, founding father. I intended to study the colonial era, and I really honestly didn't think I had anything I could contribute to revolutionary history. I mean, the towering figures in the field seem to have done most of the work. And then, so I was looking at, my dissertation was on Quakers and their, what, if any, contribution they made to early American political thought. And as I was researching this, John Dickinson's name kept coming up, and I was like, who is this person? And why is his name coming up in all these, these contexts in relation to Quakers? And then when I started to look into him, I realized that there was just utter confusion, and the historians had no idea what to make of him. And I could understand him because he was kind of like me, a fellow traveler of Quakers. I went to a Quaker college, and I had been researching Quakerism. And I thought a lot of it was very interesting, but I never wanted to become a Quaker myself. And so this person who was very close to the Religious Society of Friends, but who was not a Quaker, made perfect sense to me. And so I thought, well, all right, then I should, explain him. And so my first book, Quaker Constitutionalism and the Political Thought of John Dickinson, does that. So it sort of, the first half is on Quaker political thought, and the second half is how John Dickinson was, sort of the best exemplar of it. And it just sort of made sense to keep going once I realized that he had all of these writings that were so central to the founding and had never been fully published. And so I I started in on that. And then the governor of Delaware asked me to write the Dickinson biography really sooner than I was ready to write it. And he kind of made me an offer I couldn't refuse, which was a heck of a lot of money to, free me up from my other commitments to write the biography. And so it appeared probably 20 years too early, but I'm sure that there will be, errors will crop up as my team, annotates his documents and, we kind of nail down the facts. But, this to date is really the only biography that really covers his entire life and does so. I'm sure it will be more accurate than anything that is out there, and hopefully, it will minimize the confusion and raise awareness in the American public about this very important founder.
All right, so you say that he's very important. Can you say who he is, just for those in our audience who aren't familiar with him? Because his name doesn't come up in the first, 5 if you're sort of like list the founders.
Yeah, that's true. It's taken me literally a couple of decades to fully understand myself how vital he was, and I think really it wasn't until I even finished the biography where I kind of stood back and went, "Oh my goodness, I really had no idea." And so, in short, he was America's first America's first celebrity. The first celebrity in the Atlantic world was the minister George Whitefield, but Dickinson was the first American-born celebrity, and he became, the spokesman around the Atlantic world for the American cause after he wrote Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. So, but he was actually also the only major figure who was present and active in America from the very beginning of the tensions with Britain at the Stamp Act crisis, all the way through and beyond the ratification of the Bill of Rights. And at every point, he was central and instrumental to what was happening with, from writing the documents at the Stamp Act Congress to, writing his Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, and then sort of, very instrumental in the First and Second Continental Congresses. And then afterwards, and we can talk about this later, but after he refused to vote on or sign the Declaration of Independence, he then joined the battalion he founded and went to meet the British. And then later he enlisted as a private in the Delaware militia, something no other gentleman of his stature did that. And then he was president first of Delaware and then of Pennsylvania, and for a while simultaneously. And then he was the chairman of the Annapolis Convention, and then he was a major figure at the Constitutional Convention, and he served in the Delaware Constitutional Convention and the Delaware Legislature, and then he continued in his retirement to be one of not just a leading philanthropist and founding many schools and educational institutions and libraries, the first Prison Reform Society, but he was also behind the scenes writing legislation for Delaware, for Pennsylvania, and pushing for legislation at the federal level as well. And so there is really no way to fully understand the American founding era without engaging with this individual and the writings he produced and the role he played both before and after the Revolution.
This episode of Too Complicated for History is brought to you by our supporters over on Patreon. If you'd like to support the show and join the conversation, our membership is completely free. And that gives you access to our Discord, which is a place for like-minded history fans and even some of the historians that we've interviewed to just chat, hang out, and ask interesting questions. Our paid tiers give you access to exclusive content, live streams, and even signed book giveaways. Check it out today at patreon.com/primarysourcemedia. That's patreon.com/primarysourcemedia. Pat should put it in a graphic right about here. Now let's get back to the show.
So I'm just curious, what happened? He sounds like a superstar. He sounds like somebody that should be in the first or second paragraph of every kid's textbook about the founding or the revolution, but we don't hear about him. So he was a celebrity then. Why isn't he the same level of celebrity now?
Yeah, well, it really, again, sort of took me writing the biography and really kind of digging into the primary sources to figure this out. And so there are myriad reasons. And because this is a too complicated for history podcast, it probably makes sense to get into the weeds a little bit. So I would say there are several reasons. I mean, the easy reasons to identify are that his papers were never, until now, were never collected and published in full. And so people really just didn't even know what he did, or they would, use a lot of the documents not knowing that he had written them. So that's one problem. And also, historians could come along, and since there wasn't really, a record on him like there was for the other major founders, or at least not one that was accessible, they could kind of get away with saying whatever they wanted. And so that kind of takes us to the second and kind of easy reason, which is that many modern historians dismiss religion as an actual factor in the American Revolution. There are several, leading historians who will make no bones about saying they think religion had nothing to do with the revolution, which is just sort of factually incorrect. And so if religion in general is not understood, certainly Quakerism, a dissenting tradition, was even less understood. I mean, Quakerism has a very robust history of Quakers writing Quaker history, but that it hasn't made it really into the mainstream. And so when Dickinson was sort of like, well, was he a Quaker? Wasn't he a Quaker? And that question is really not really applicable. It doesn't really matter for Quakers and Quakerism. That's only a question people who don't understand Quakerism will ask. And so, but if they thought he was a Quaker, they were just like, what does this mean? And they would just sort of dismiss it and dismiss him. So, and along with that, knowing that Quakers are now pacifists, it was very easy to say, oh, well, he must have been a Quaker pacifist and therefore was opposed to any kind of war or violence. And so, of course he didn't, he didn't want, a revolution. Well, I mean, there's something to that, except that all falls apart when you look, he had one of the more extensive military records among the founders. Okay. So then that's all kind of building up to what I really see as sort of the main reason. And again, it took me really digging into the sources in the biography to come to this conclusion. It did not come to me overnight. In essence, if there is one major reason that Dickinson is unknown today, it is because of John Adams. And John Adams was, look, John Adams is a fascinating figure. I personally kind of enjoy him and enjoy teaching about him. I think he was extraordinarily bright, and he played a very important role in the revolution. And but he also was a very sort of like flawed character, and even Adams, fans of John Adams understand that he was an unreliable narrator. He was among the things that he struggled with, and he even knew this about himself. He was a deeply insecure and jealous person, and there was no one on the planet of whom John Adams was more jealous of than Dickinson. And he started out as really Dickinson's fan, as my students would say. He was Dickinson's fanboy. I mean, he just kind of practically swooned when he met him before the first Continental Congress, and just would write all of these glowing things in his diary about having dinner at Dickinson's estate, and how charming he was, what a wonderful patriot, and all this stuff, just really over the top. But then, when Dickinson joined the Congress and Dickinson's writings basically supplanted John Adams' writings, he got jealous and he got angry. And jealous, angry Adams lashes out. And so he started then at that point kind of making it his main goal to take Dickinson down. And so then, and we can maybe get into this a little bit more detail later. I'll just give you the short version now. He basically he wrote a letter after the closing session, first session of the Second Congress. He wrote a letter in which he famously or infamously called Dickinson a great fortune and a piddling genius, and said that what he was doing was, giving a silly cast to all of our doings in Congress. And so he wrote this to Abigail, and he wrote this to a friend, and in doing so, he sort of violated the secrecy oath of Parliament. Of Congress, and he and so when the letter was intercepted by the British and published, everybody knew what he had said, and he was shunned by other members of Congress, and he later recanted in a letter to a mutual friend of his and Dickinson's, and said, "Oh, I didn't really mean it." But then the damage was done, and then 30 years later, in his diary, he recounted this episode again, and he made up stories. He made things up that, or at least he told a story that can't be confirmed by the evidence. And in fact, there are things to dispute it. And what I mean is that he basically told a story that favored his interpretation and denigrated Dickinson, and basically cast Dickinson as this kind of effeminate, trembling, cowardly person who just had not enough sort of, kind of intestinal fortitude to stand up and do what had to be done. And so then when the first major history of the Revolution was written, this was by George Bancroft beginning in the 1840s. George Bancroft was a New Englander, inclined to be favorable to other New Englanders like Adams, and unfavorable to Quakers, who New Englanders still didn't like even after a couple of centuries. And he wrote an absolutely scathing interpretation of Dickinson, where it's almost like this sort of like personal vendetta he had against Dickinson, and again, just painting him as this sort of loyalist, effeminate foil to the manly John Adams, and just, really just eviscerated Dickinson's legacy. And then there wasn't a biography of Dickinson then until the 1890s. And that was a decent one for the time. But then the next biography wasn't until 1983, and it was quite flawed and sort of confused and confusing. And and then the next one was in 2013 by a conservative journalist, and it was published by a sort of a far right wing organization, and it wasn't the worst biography I've ever read, except that it painted Dickinson as a quote unquote like American Burke, which just makes no sense in context, because Dickinson supported the French Revolution, and Burke was made his sort of conservative credentials by opposing it. So, and Dickinson in some ways was absolutely a radical, and we can talk about that later too. But in any case, then we see someone like, David McCullough and his, really, best-selling biography of Adams, really taking up this sort of neo-Bancroftian view of Dickinson. And then the HBO miniseries, again, very much an Adams view of Dickinson, and just bearing no resemblance to Dickinson as he actually was. And so, my biography is, kind of aims to set things right and contextualize things, and show Dickinson as he was viewed by the people who saw him, who knew him at the time. And he was idolized by the American people, even after independence.
Well, if there's something to say about Adams, amongst the many things that he was a very good lawyer, and that sounds like a very lawyerly way to tell a story.
Sure.
But yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you so much for sort of like contextualizing not just the history of Dickinson, but sort of like how we have come to understand him as we do.
Right.
It's very interesting. You're in a unique position as a historian where you're doing both of those things, where you're sort of writing the thing that is for consumption, while also doing the technical work of kind of cataloging the papers, which is not typically how it's done, right, Lynn? That's not usually
because
how
that's two really, really big jobs. I mean, two separate. Those are two completely more than full-time jobs.
That is true.
I mean, how many papers does he have? I know it's just an estimation, but to let people realize like how prolific he was,
Well,
about how many papers?
Yeah, so I mean, it's difficult to get a handle on sort of the entire corpus of sort of every scrap of paper that Dickinson touched in the course of his life. I mean, we can do that for for the other major founders, Washington, Jefferson, because these projects have been at work for literally for decades, collecting every scrap. And there was a feasibility study written for a Dickinson project in the 1980s, and the estimate at that time was that the whole universe of Dickinson papers was about 10,000 items. I don't know. That seems high to me now because we have collected almost everything, and we're still and cataloged everything, including some non-Dickinson, documents that were written by people other than Dickinson. And our catalog has it's still under 6,000 items. But more to your point, Lynn, I estimate that his published writings or his writings for the American cause specifically, like essays and tracts and treatises, pamphlets and speeches, that sort of thing. I estimate at around 800. And really, like, he wrote more for the founding than any other single figure by far.
Wow.
Just not even close. And this is like not just newspaper articles and broadsides and things where he made a special point of reaching out to ordinary Americans, the quote unquote lower sort of people who most elite men did not believe had any role in politics. And Dickinson really wanted them to join in and believe that everybody had an obligation to participate and at least join in the discussion. And so he did those kinds of writings, but then also at the highest levels, the declarations, the petitions, the constitutions, the legislation, things that were, at the highest levels of government. Dickinson also wrote more of those things as well. I mean, you cannot turn around in the founding era without running into something he wrote.
God, that's a lot of documents.
Yeah.
As someone who's worked in documentary editing, that's a lot of documents.
And that's fascinating because it's really interesting that he was focused on at least connecting with sort of just the upper echelons of society, because that was actually, it's not often talked about, but we've had a couple of discussions about it on this podcast, that was incredibly important for the success of the revolution. Like there was like an East-West sort of like, for bourgeois proletariat divide in that time where people were just sort of like, those are the wrong words to use, but in terms of, traders and people who were involved in the international, larger moneyed holdings that were closer to the coasts versus the farmers and the people who end up making the bulk of those militias that ended up doing the fighting. It's super. How did he view those people? Like, why did he want them to participate?
Well, so this gets back to the Quakerism that he grew up with. You have to understand a little bit about Quaker theology and ecclesiology to understand Dickinson, because otherwise, most historians have sort of just said, "Oh, well, he was a Whig," and I mean, sure, there were some, certainly very Whiggish tendencies. I mean, he definitely subscribed to, a lot of the basic, principles and beliefs, and, he read the same authors and, republicanism, all that stuff. Yes, yes, yes. But he was, strikingly different from the leaders we sort of we know are sort of more traditional sort of Whig leaders. And okay, so Quakers believe that there is what they call, the light of God in every individual. It's God's light, so it's the same light that can, in theory, be found by the individual going inward into his or her conscience and looking inward, finding the light, knowing what God wants, and then going outward into the world to change the world according to God's law.
Sure.
Okay.
And so the Quakers believed that every single person could experience the light if his or her soul were properly cultivated to receive it. And that included women, it included Black people, it included Native Americans. And so, and this goes to sort of the Quakers kind of this understanding they had that the two important aspects of their sort of religious polity were unity and dissent. They needed to be unified so that they could collectively understand what God wanted, because God might speak through any individual, even the one you would suspect the least of having anything to offer. People always had to be prepared for God to speak through the most unlikely person. And so in that way, they had to be prepared to accept a dissenting view. And then because that dissenter might be bringing them God's truth. So, for example, in the early to mid 18th century, there were some Quakers who were starting to agitate for abolition of slavery. And the first person to do this really in a notable way was a guy named Benjamin Lay. And he was kind of a funny little guy, very, very passionate about his beliefs. And he brought his anti-slavery message to the Quaker meeting in a very disruptive way. He sought to shock their consciences and to provoke them. And so he did some very kind of like outlandish things, like showing up in a military uniform to meeting, and at a crucial moment, throwing back his cloak to reveal the uniform, and taking out a Bible that had been hollowed out and filled with a red bladder of liquid, stabbing it so the Bible bled. And this was to show the violence of man against man that slavery does. And well, that got him disowned from the meeting, of course. He was kicked out. Not long after that, another guy came along named John Woolman, and he knew better than to approach the meeting that way. He took the unity very seriously. So first of all, he waited for the old Quaker enslavers to die off, so they that power was kind of gone. And then he approached Quakers with a very sort of conciliatory message, saying like, hey, I know you think you're doing the right thing, by keeping these people, but really, is it really the Christian thing to do? And maybe you should sort of look inwards and ask yourself if this is really what God wants. And that was the beginning of the abolition movement, first among Quakers, and then it spread, beyond Quakers to other Americans. And so Dickinson, although he was, not a Quaker, he had been raised a Quaker, and he also believed in sort of, that God's, or, that even the least person, he says this in his first farmer's letter, published in, the end of 1767. And he says, basically, even, a poor person, ought to speak up, because he will never know what kind of change he might create. And then he reiterated that same call 20 years later in his Fabius letters, trying to get the Constitution ratified, where he said, it's not, everyone has not just a right, but a duty to engage. And so, yeah, he really believed in ordinary people having a voice. And, we could debate whether he meant that to be also a vote, but certainly a voice in the sort of deliberations.
Oh, wow, that's incredibly helpful context. And that even I grew up in Southeast Pennsylvania, just outside of Philadelphia, so I'm sort of familiar with Quakerism sort of in its modern context. But even like the level of depth and context, I had not encountered that you were just talking about. So appreciate that. That's really interesting.
Yeah, I've always been interested in his writings and the letters from farmer in Pennsylvania, and did he give himself that pen name? And now we know he didn't sign the Declaration of Independence. I don't want to ask that yet, why he didn't, but the years coming up to that, sort of what was going on with him and his, Pennsylvania letters that sort of led him to make that decision. And then you can sort of, explain what happened during that decision.
He he chose this pen name, I think he wanted to evoke a couple of things. There certainly was a sort of Roman ideal of the citizen close to the land who was virtuous and, which meant disinterested, and that he had a stake in his country because he was a landowner. And so,
Right.
he wanted to evoke that, but there was also very much a Quaker sensibility about being close to the land, being close to God, and using, nature as sort of a retreat, and, gardening and communing with nature as a way to be close to God. And so he, there have been some people I've seen who have said, oh, well, he was just, kind of lying to the people because he wasn't a farmer at all. He was a lawyer and a statesman. I mean, yes, he was a lawyer and he was a statesman, but he also had inherited, his father's plantation, which still actually exists outside of Dover in Delaware. And so this was his boyhood home, and he still owned it, and he would go back there when he wanted respite from the world. And he was on the verge of marrying a woman named Mary Norris, who went by Polly, and she was the daughter of the leading Quaker politician in Pennsylvania, who was the Speaker of the House, Isaac Norris. And so when they got married, he did move to their estate, which was outside of Philadelphia, in a beautiful rural retreat. So in any case, it had these very strong connotations of both, classical virtue, and also this, Quaker communing with God.
Mhm.
And he chose this name and this sort of persona. Everyone knew exactly what kind of farmer he was. He wasn't a dirt farmer. He wasn't walking behind a plow and with dirt under his fingernails. He was a gentleman farmer, and he was doing exactly what a gentleman should do. He was, speaking to the upper sorts of people, and you can see his letters have copious sort of scholarly footnotes, and there's a whole ongoing debate in those. They are footnotes, and then the letters themselves are straightforward. They are easily accessible. I mean, students today find them very easy to read, and to they find them very engaging. And he was doing what a gentleman was supposed to do in that era, which was to condescend to the lower sorts of people. That is, to lower himself to their level and speak to them and explain things to them. And so the upper sorts trusted him as one of their own, because he said, look, I have this property, I have a library, I have an education. And, and so they said, oh yeah, he's one of us. But the lower sorts of people, the working people, they said, oh no, but he is doing what a gentleman should do. He is lowering himself to speak to us. So everybody trusted him. So as we go forward, and his reputation just exploded. And the first thing that happened, before the letters were even all published, the city of the town of Boston decided that they were going to thank him and for writing these letters. And so they did. They got together and they issued a former letter of gratitude that was published in the papers. And then the Massachusetts legislature did exactly what the farmer wanted, which was for them to unify and resist peacefully. And they issued their famous circular letter to all of the colonial legislatures, and that was done in direct response to the farmers' letters. And then everything just sort of exploded, and he became this celebrity. And really then nobody would really do anything in the colonies without either asking his advice in advance, or if they didn't ask his advice in advance, they'd ask him afterwards for help with dealing with their situation. Like, for example, when after the Boston Massacre, when Josiah Quincy and John Adams were defending the British soldiers, they quoted the farmers' letters to the jury and said, well, we didn't follow his advice, and look what we got. And so this is on us and not on the soldiers. Then let's see. after the people of Rhode Island burned the schooner Gaspee off the coast of Rhode Island, and they were worried about the British, coming down on them and punishing them. They frantically wrote to Dickinson and begged for his advice. Please tell us what to do. And then after the Boston Tea Party, Samuel Adams wrote to Dickinson and was like, okay, we might have gotten a little too extreme here. Please help us. Give us your advice. Alexander McDougall, when he was arrested for libel, he wrote to Dickinson a couple of times begging for Dickinson to serve as his attorney. And so, all of these leaders, and the Lees in Virginia as well, were looking to him for, to follow him. And so it's a misconception that the American Revolutionary Movement grew up organically across the colonies with no single leader. Dickinson was the leader. All the leaders of the colonies were local. Dickinson was the only one who was colony-wide. And so they were all looking to him and following his guidance. So then, in advance of the first Congress, Dickinson, with help of allies like Charles Thompson, really sort of wrangled these hostile factions, factions who had been at each other's throats for decades. Dickinson managed to get them all more or less on the same page and working together because all of them trusted him. Whenever they would put forth sort of, tickets or groups of men to serve on committees, Dickinson was always on all of the tickets. So then when the first Congress met, it was his agenda that they followed, even though he was actually not sitting in Congress until the very end. His agenda was the agenda of the first Congress. And then when he came in at the end, he ended up authoring, it's hard to pin it down exactly, but really about four of the 6 documents that Congress produced. And then his influence carried through to the next Congress, and he also dominated that up until really his influence really didn't start to wane until the fall of 1775, and at which point the colonies started to begin forming Republican governments, and Dickinson wrote new instructions to the Pennsylvania Assembly about how the delegates to Congress should vote on any question of independence that would come before them. And he wrote very clear instructions, and he said, absolutely, under no circumstances should you be voting for anything that would lead to a break with Britain. And so that was November of 1775. And as things continued into 76, and Thomas Paine's Common Sense came out, and it became increasingly clear as the months progressed that America was headed towards independence. And Dickinson was terrified about the fact that America wasn't ready. And I mean, this was really kind of the only reasonable position at the time. We had no constitution. We had barely a military. We had no way to produce arms or ammunition. We had no foreign support. We had no unity amongst the people. There was a sizable portion of the population that really did not want independence, and it wasn't just Quakers. It was other people as well, not just loyalists either, but Americans who just didn't think it was the right thing to do. So even though Dickinson did not want independence, he knew it was going to happen, and so he did everything he could to prepare Americans. So not only did he take the lead in getting the military ready, and for a time, even though he was only a colonel in the Pennsylvania militia, he had sort of de facto control over the entire Pennsylvania militia. He was instrumental in writing military policy, and so preparing for war. And then sort of the crucial moment in June of 1776, there were three principal committees that were established. There was the Committee for the Declaration. There was the Committee for the Articles of Confederation, the first Constitution, and there was a committee for the to come up with some kind of model treaty that we could use for foreign relations. So John Adams was placed on the Declaration Committee and the Treaty Committee. Dickinson was placed on the Articles of Confederation Committee and the Treaty Committee. Adams didn't really have much input to the Declaration, and he actually kind of took himself out of that, so as I understand it, and if Adams is to be believed. And then Dickinson more or less single-handedly wrote the first draft of the Articles of Confederation. There had been an earlier draft by Benjamin Franklin from 1775, but that had never been considered by Congress. And I think Dickinson had it in front of him, but he did not use it as a model, really. Instead, what he used as a model, for some of it at least, was the Pennsylvania Constitution, and he wrote an extensive clause to protect religious liberty, or at least toleration. So religious liberty in Pennsylvania, religious toleration in other colonies. And in writing that provision, he also did something really remarkable, which I argue is the most revolutionary moment of the Revolution, and that is that he wrote gender-inclusive language to protect women's religious liberty, but also their freedom of public speech, because Quaker women preached, and he wrote in there that all persons should be able to practice his or her religion. So, and practice religion was public speaking for women, for Quaker women. So that was really quite radical. Of course, that was all excised, and the version that passed had no resemblance to what Dickinson wrote. But then the other committee was the committee for the model treaty. If you look at the Adams Papers, which is a remarkable project, you will find Adams' draft of the plan of treaties, and the editors have a nice long, very informative introduction to it, and so they explain that he wrote the first 13 provisions, and then he more or less kind of copied the remaining. There were I think a total of 33. So I think the remaining ones remaining 20. Can I do math? Yeah, 20. He more or less copied from law books, on Law of Nations books. Mm-hmm. And okay, so and Adams took credit for it, as it seemed he should, and this was the blueprint for American foreign policy up until World War II, according to the editors of the Adams Papers. Well, in writing the biography, I came across what I am pretty certain is an earlier draft of those first 13 provisions. And it looks to me, and this needs to be, both projects need to sort of roll up our sleeves and get in there and look at this stuff very closely. But to me, it looks like Dickinson drafted the first 10 of these provisions and then wrote notes for the next 3 of them. And Adams more or less just made a clean copy of those.
Oh.
And that is huge.
Yeah.
Huge. So, so I've just given you actually the 2 best examples of the kinds of discoveries that the JDP, the John Dickinson Writings Project, is making, namely this, first ever mention of women's, protection for women's religious liberty in a constitution, and also this new discovery about the model treaty. And so this is why these documentary editing projects are so vital and deserve all the funding that we can get.
Yeah, that's remarkable. Considering, I think that the Letters of Pennsylvania Farmer is as much as I thought it was, as far as influence that John Dickinson had. But it seems you're painting the picture of a guy who had his hand in everything. And there were so many parts of the biography where I was writing, and it was so difficult because there were a lot of episodes that I needed to deal with. I have these very messy, chaotic papers that clearly pertained to certain episodes about which I could find almost no secondary sources. For example, the year 1779, when he was in Congress,
there is almost nothing written on this. And so there was a lot of sort of, building of scaffolding that I had to do from scratch, and I hope I got it right. But and also as his presidency of Pennsylvania, just no one had ever written a really detailed account of what he was doing as president of Pennsylvania, and it was a ton. So yeah, just so much stuff. But this is why by the end of the biography, I was just kind of jaw on the floor, just like, oh my goodness, I didn't even have any idea myself of how ubiquitous he was and how central to everything that he was. And it still just blows my mind.
Huh.
Yeah, you're
That's
not
amazing.
the only one.
Right?
Yeah.
I knew he was important, but goodness sakes. And you actually say one of my favorite quotes in the book is where you say that if any one person could be credited for bringing the United States into being, so if you were forced for there one person to be named, that it would be Dickinson.
Yeah, I mean, it's an absurd prospect, right? I mean,
right. But under duress, if you were
under
forced.
duress, and also, I mean, but I think there are historians who have not been shy about coming out and saying, "Oh, well, it was George Washington, or it was Benjamin."
Oh, yeah.
And they will just
Absolutely.
say that without any qualifications, and they're wrong. Yep. And I would be wrong if I claimed that kind of influence for Dickinson, but I don't think you can find any single person who was there every place contributing so much, so tirelessly from beginning to end. And I think the key for me is that, I mean, okay, so historians, Lynn, full well, we don't like counterfactuals, we don't like what ifs, we don't like. Yeah. But okay, so I was kind of playing a little mind game with myself about this, and I was like, okay, what would the American resistance have looked like if there had not been a Dickinson? Let's just say there was Pennsylvania, so there was hot-headed Massachusetts to the north, kind of like slave-owning, hot-headed people to the south. Then in the middle would be just dead center Quakers who didn't want any part of this, and then a lot of angry people angry at the Quakers, so kind of turmoil there. What would things have looked like? Well, so just to sort of play this game, what would have happened is Massachusetts would have, of course, taken the lead, which it did in a lot of ways, but there would have been no check on its violence. And it would have basically come out and just, rioted and done more of what it actually did do, taunting of British soldiers and destruction of property. And so even more quickly and even more strongly, the British government would have come down on them, would have come down, harder on New York, which was sort of joining in with all that stuff. And it would have, really just, brought down the full force of the British government on New England and those sort of upper middle, the New York and those upper middle colonies. And then, same thing with the South, they would have, kind of gone headlong into revolution, and it all would have been much bloodier, and it would have been the movement would have been nipped in the bud, and their worst fears would have come to pass, as they would have had truly a tyrannical government, quashing all of their rights. And so, what Dickinson did was he gave them a very practical way of resisting. And if you don't mind, let me just back up for just a second. So basically, like if you're looking at if you're looking at political thought of the era, you have mainly like two main streams of thought. You have the sort of, the Tory on the one side, and you've got the Whig on the other, and you have Quakers kind of in the middle. And now every group has sort of a theory about like, what do you do if the government is tyrannical? But how each one of these groups answered that question was was significantly different. So Tories, their response to a tyrannical ruler is to, quote unquote, pray and petition. And by praying, they meant pleading with the crown, because they believed in more or less in divine right monarchy. And so if the king wants or queen wants to do it, God approves. He is God, he or she is God's vice regent on earth and can do whatever he or she wants. And the people have nothing to say about it. Now, he should allow rights and should allow liberties, but it's not obligatory upon him to do so. And so they could pray and they could petition and they could basically plead for relief. And the king might grant it or he might not. Sure. And so, but you're at his mercy. On the other hand, were the Whigs, who also agreed that they needed to start with praying and petitioning. But if that didn't work, they believed that they had not just the right, but the duty to engage in revolution. Or I should flip that, not just the duty, but the right. The duty was to God. The right was for themselves. And so they could go ahead and, resist the tyrant by force of arms, and overthrow him and replace him and the government with something that would protect their rights and liberties. And so it started out as the Puritan theory of revolution, which was implemented in the English Civil War. And, Charles I was beheaded. And then it evolved into this more secular version of the Whig theory of revolution. Now, Quakers, they were in between. They said, absolutely, we get to resist, but we can only do so peacefully. So Quakers were basically an amalgam of Puritanism and Anabaptism. Puritans were very aggressive, and Anabaptists were pacifists, so they were kind of passive aggressive, right? And and they said, yes, we can resist, but we can only do so peacefully. And they invented the theory and practice of civil disobedience. And so that's what Dickinson came out with and said, okay, people, we shouldn't have rights. I mean, we shouldn't have riots, and we should not have just surreptitiously evading the law. We need to, and this is what he said during the Stamp Act resistance, he said, we need to basically engage in our, go ahead with our business as usual and just ignore the Stamp Act, ignore the offending legislation, and they will have nothing to do but repeal it. And so he was the first person to advocate civil disobedience to the American people, but it didn't really become accepted and popularized until Martin Luther King wrote his letter from a Birmingham jail in 1963. He was mentored by Quakers, and Quakers published the first 50,000 copies of the letter from the Birmingham jail.
Huh.
Wow.
That's an incredible thread.
Yeah.
That's an incredible historical thread. And I think your thought, as not to indulge in the counterfactual, but I think you're so right in, it's underappreciated how tenuous that early army was. And because I've done some reading on the Howe brothers letters, who voted against sending the military from England to the United States because they believed that these were British subjects that were advocating for their own rights. And the only reason we survived was because they didn't want to crush us. If they wanted to crush us, they could have.
Right.
It would have been very easy.
And if Americans weren't united, and if it were just like little pockets of, angry,
it would be even easier.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, they I mean, because the divide, conquer. I mean, we Americans would have just been at their mercy.
Yeah, that's an amazing. Oh man, I'm bummed that we're getting towards the end of our hour. We might have to come back for some sort of like Patreon exclusive part 2 or something like that.
There's
but
a
I do
lot
want to ask. There's so much here, and I don't want to open up a whole can of worms. But just before we sort of have to wrap, before we have to start wrapping things up. But so since he had a hand in with the articles, how did he feel about the critical period as opposed to the revolution? Like, what is his when the articles are proving insufficient? Mm-hmm. Did he have any? Was he writing? Was he involved? Was he sort of? Obviously, you said his influence had waned a little bit by that point.
Well, no. I mean, so at that point, okay. So if we're looking at 1777, Okay, so let me go back and do a little chronology here. So
Sure.
he returned from the front in like end of September 1776, and he immediately was elected into the Pennsylvania Assembly. But he didn't stay there long because he wanted that Constitution to be amended to protect civil rights, which it currently didn't. And when they refused, he basically picked up his marbles and left, and his
Okay.
supporters left, and the assembly couldn't make a quorum, and they ended up pursuing Dickinson as an enemy of the state, more or less.
Really?
Yeah, they basically fabricated charges against him, and they pursued him as an enemy of the state. They distrained his property. They basically commandeered one of his houses and cost him about £10,000, which was like around over $1 million, in colonial money. And so he then kind of went. I mean, he tried to face them, but they wouldn't meet him. But then he sort of retreated to his home in outside of Dover. And then the first thing he did after all this, he did two things. First thing was that he freed the people he had enslaved. It was a conditional manumission at first, but then by in 1786 he freed all of them unconditionally. So that was huge. No other leading founder did that. And he also worked for abolition. He wrote abolition legislation and, tried, it didn't pass in Delaware, but anyway. And then the other thing he did was he enlisted as a private in the Delaware militia. Okay. But then by 1781, he was elected to be president of Delaware, and Delaware was really a failing state, and he was really trying to get Delaware and other states to pay their taxes so that we could actually wage the war, and so he really he completely turned Delaware from a failing state to a model state. He revamped every major system, the courts, the militia. He actually wrote a drill manual, and reviewed the troops himself, and very, very hands-on. And then before his, really at the end of his first term, he was reelected, but then he was also elected to the Pennsylvania presidency. And he again went in there trying to make this state, this is like the most powerful central, state where the seat of the United States government is. And he went in trying to get, Pennsylvania to also pay taxes and do what it needed to do. And he started speaking out saying, like, we have to reform the Articles of Confederation. These are not working.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, he started, I mean, I want to say it was, maybe it was at least 1783 when he was calling for reform of the Articles of Confederation. I mean, and that whole thing, Pennsylvania, and so Dickinson at various times, like I would say in 1775 when he controlled the whole Pennsylvania militia, he really rivaled George Washington for being the most powerful man in America. Same when he was president of Pennsylvania, because it was one of the biggest states. It was the most central state. It was the location of the seat of the United States government. And we did not have a separate court. So basically the Pennsylvania courts doubled as a U.S. Supreme Court. And Dickinson was the head of that judiciary. So he was, again, the only person who could rival him for power was George Washington. There's a lot more that can be said about that. But yes, so Dickinson was acutely aware that the articles were not up to the task of serving as a constitution for the country.
Gosh,
yeah,
I feel like there's so many things to ask.
Yeah, I'm a little bit very mad that we're at 59 minutes in this conversation.
Right?
Because we haven't even talked about the Constitutional Convention.
Or the Annapolis Convention. We haven't
right.
even gotten to there's a lot to talk about. Oh, man.
Well, you know what people need to do, our listeners need to do? They need to get the book.
Yes.
There it is. There it is. It's on the book. So
Yeah, just so are there any other places where your lectures are online, or any other ways for people to
yeah,
engage with
I
your
mean,
work?
Google
Yeah.
me. I don't Google myself because I don't watch them. I can't listen to them. But I understand
Yeah.
if you Google me, go to YouTube. That yes, there are other lectures and things online.
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll do some digging and put some links in the show notes and the
Yeah.
description for anyone who's interested in diving deeper. I know I am, and I'm very excited to learn more about Dickinson, and excited for the future of the project, the John Dickinson Writing
Yeah. Where
Project.
where are you in the project right now, and what should people be looking for? Should, go to your website and
Yes, go to the website where you can find
Mhm.
volumes 1 through 3. We are
Okay.
at this moment typesetting volume 4, so we are, and that takes us up to 1769. We've made a really good start on volume 5, and we're dabbling in 6, and we're about to apply for another. More grants and
Mhm.
try to keep our funding up, which is right now we have for really the first time in the history of the project, which was I found it in like 2010. And we
Mhm.
now are fully staffed where we've never had that luxury before. So we have, in addition to me, we have an associate editor who manages the day to day. And we've got 4 full time editors who are just phenomenal. Their work is so amazing. I'm just astounded by them every day. And then we've got two part-time editors, and we've got like a voluntary legal team to deal with the legal case notes because those are crazy hard.
Nice.
So yeah,
Yeah.
we are motoring along, and volume 4 is that contains the farmers' letters and sort of all the
Oh, wow.
celebrity documents, and we also publish documents that were published about Dickinson. So poems and toasts and
Okay.
advertisements using his name and then all the weird, awful hater stuff, troll stuff. I mean, lots of trolly stuff. Um,
Need that too.
yeah, the celebrity has to have his haters. So he
Uh,
was a legit celebrity.
and it's important for context, so anyone in the future that's going in and wants to dive in can get all the
Yeah.
information and all the context that they need. That's amazing.
Yeah,
um well, I know I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation, and the only
same.
last question that I have for you is, one of the things that we like to remind our listeners is that they probably
Oh
live
yeah.
within an hour of something cool historically. Are there any Dickinson Central sites that might be neat for people to go visit
Mhm.
if if they're planning a road trip and are historically inclined?
Yes, absolutely. They should absolutely go down to the John Dickinson plantation outside of Dover. It's a little bit off the beaten path, but it's so worth it. The interpreters
Mm.
there do just a phenomenal job. It's a beautiful, manor house. It was the grandest of the era. It's very modest compared to say Monticello or Mount Vernon
Hmm.
because it was built in circa 1740. So it's a very different kind of thing. But there's that. And then, unfortunately, Dickinson had multiple houses in the Delaware Valley, but that's the only one that remains. Nevertheless,
Mm.
um, if they wanted to go to Stenton outside Philadelphia, that was where that's where his wife spent a lot of time. She was related to the Logans of Stenton, and so
Hmm.
she kind of grew up there in part, along with Fairhill, which the British destroyed. But Stenton is it's breathtaking, and that's
Mm.
actually where I think both of Dickinson's daughters are buried, and other female relatives of his wife, and yeah, I mean, his wife is a whole other show. I mean, the whole uh, she and her female relatives, they were all Quaker poets, and they had their own little sorority. And Dickinson just moved right on in when he married her and lived with the women, and that's a whole thing. Yeah, I mean, I tell you, he is not your average founder. But yeah, so I would say first and foremost, Poplar Hall, the John Dickinson plantation, and
Mhm.
close second for like his kind of adult life and his relatives by marriage is Stenton.
Very cool.
Yeah. Gosh,
Thank you
thank
for the
you.
recommendations. If any of the listeners go there, please, send us pictures.
Yeah, and thank you so much for taking your time to talk with us today. That went by so fast.
Oh my goodness, it did. This was so much fun, you guys.
It did. It was a great conversation. And as always, this conversation was brought to you in part by our supporters over on Patreon. If you'd like more content like this, please go check out patreon.com/primary source media and join us. You can join for free, get access to our Discord, and then where you can get in contact with me and Lynn and many of the historians that we interview. And then there are paid tiers where you get exclusive content and early access to the content from us and some of our partners in the history world. So thanks again, Dr. Calvert, for being with us.
Thanks so much for having me. This was really fun.